Hello everyone, welcome to another day of disappointment. For those of you following the news, yes, Rishi Sunak has indeed walked into number 10. And I do mean quite literally walked in. The 1922 Commission had to have a quick do-over of choosing another party leader who inevitably becomes PM, and the only way to get through will have been to have the support of at least 100 MPs. And Rishi Sunak technically wasn't the only one with over 100 MPs, but Boris Johnson, who allegedly had 102, decided to drop out, and then Penny Mordaunt had high 90s, about, it was reported 10 minutes before the announcement, but then decided to drop out 5 minutes before the announcement of MP backers. So with that, the vote didn't go to the membership, who more than likely will have rejected Rishi Sunak. And so after all this, we have Rishi Sunak as PM, as he was unopposed. And there we have it, our first Prime Minister of Indian descent has walked into number 10. Even though the party rejected him first time round, the senior MPs are going to get what they want. And it could either mean the ruin of the party or a revigoration of the party. I am looking much more at the former, because he's being dealt quite the hand, the same hand that Truss was given, only Truss made it ever so slightly worse, thanks to a huge media campaign to try and discredit her. So now we have a bit of chaos in the Tory party, and Sunak has to deal with that too. But the Times go into details on other issues. So what will Rishi Sunak do as PM? His policy plans so far, from war in Ukraine to a looming crisis in the NHS, Liz Truss's successor faces a bulging in-tray and a divided party. It is an enviable position, and yet he took it, so I suppose I have some respect for that. So firstly, Austerity 2.0, even though Austerity 1.0 was raise taxes but don't actually cut spending, when Austerity is supposed to be raising taxes and cutting spending. So the problem, even after Jeremy Hunt junked Truss's disastrous mini-budget, Britain still faces a £40 billion black hole in its finances by 2026 and 2027. Markets may have reacted positively, with the pound rising against the dollar and the government borrowing costs falling, but this does not make the scale of the task easier, and both those things are true. The pound has risen against the dollar, and the gilts that I've been going on about for the past few videos have indeed fallen close to where they were pre-mini-budget. Sunak will have to do a hard job of deciding where exactly to cut government expenditure, but Tory MPs are unlikely to accept further austerity lightly and will resist budget cuts across Whitehall. Yep, not a great position. Sunak's approach, he has already indicated a willingness to cut defence spending, keeping it at 2 rather than 3% of GDP by 2030, which would save about £157 billion in the next 8 years. So, the one place I actually want government money to be spent, it is not being spent. Sunak is also likely to target large infrastructure projects, which he only reluctantly supported as Chancellor. This could result in the breaking manifesto pledges, such as building new hospitals and rail links. So hopefully HS2 gets stopped. If we don't get the Boris Bridge and HS2 gets stopped, I am absolutely fine with that. He could go back on the government's promise to increase benefits in line with inflation, or even suspend the pensions triple lock. Both would be highly controversial, and it is unlikely that he will want to start his premiership by triggering confrontation with many MPs who elected him. In other words, he's doing the stupid thing of cutting defence spending, but at least he's doing the clever thing of not doing Keynesian big projects. Next up, the dreaded tax rises. Even with cuts, Sunak must break completely with Truss's tax-cutting agenda, and may have to raise taxes in the short term. For those of you wondering, this is part of the reason I think Truss had to be kicked out. Simply so that tax cutting is now so politically volatile that we're not going to see it for at least another decade. As a former governor of the Bank of England said on Sunday, the scale of this challenge is such that taxes would have to rise for everyone, not just the richest. Speaking to Tory MPs today, Sunak emphasised that he remained a low-tax, high-growth Conservative, but it was a question of how you got there. One option was to reverse Truss's cuts to national insurance and go back to his original plan to increase the tax by 1.25% to help fund the NHS. This will be a hard sell to Tory MPs, not least as it has already been repealed, and Sunak may look for other ways to make up the shortfall. Income tax thresholds will stay frozen, and Sunak will probably extend the windfall tax on oil and gas producers to other energy firms who have benefited from high prices. So taxes go up, and in the middle of an energy crisis, you're going to tax the energy companies more, despite the fact that the government have a much higher income per litre of oil sold or imported into this country than the energy companies do. Basically what he's done here is tax success, and I really don't think we should be putting higher taxes on the successful. Next up is energy. Problem. Stripping back the energy price guarantee put in place by Truss leaves the question of how to support households beyond April. The decisions will include who gets support, to what level, and for how long. In the longer term, the new Prime Minister must set out his position on renewables and nuclear power and decide if he wants a political fight over fracking. Well, as we know already, he doesn't want a political fight over fracking because he has already banned it. But you can tell this article came out before that because it starts with his approach, as he backed lifting of the fracking ban if there was local support, and was more aligned with Truss in preferring offshore wind, rooftop solar and nuclear power to solar farms and onshore wind. Solar farms I understand, onshore wind I really don't think is that bad these days. It is actually quite popular with the electorate, so I don't really get why you'd ban it if local communities want it. Over the summer, he said he wanted Britain to be energy independent by 2045. He previously cut VAT on home insulation, but any scheme would be expensive. On direct support, Sunak may take a similar approach to financial support throughout the pandemic, saying the government could not help everyone while committing to protect the most vulnerable. So it's interesting that he wants energy independence, but immediately just banned fracking. So this Tory Prime Minister, apparently his core audience now, in terms of energy, is Caroline Lucas. She literally clapped when he said he was going to ban fracking. So next we're going to talk about growth. Sunak must quickly decide how much of Truss's agenda he will pursue. These include contentious decisions such as fracking, relaxing planning rules on scrapping, some environmental protections to hasten growth. Then there are Truss's much vaunted plans for investment zones with tax breaks for company investment. She hoped that these supply-side reforms will be taken into account by the Office for Budget Responsibility when predicting growth rates. Sunak's approach is more cautious on many of these issues. While he backed fracking with local support, he did not make it a big issue in his leadership campaign, and in fact he banned it first thing in office. On planning, he pledged to make it harder for developers to build on greenfield sites if they have land for housing they were yet to build on. Fair enough, I suppose. He also said he would review planning laws to stop local authorities from requesting changes to greenbelt boundaries. Sunak is also likely to revisit the investment zones amid fears that they could end up displacing existing business rather than creating new opportunities. Though when it comes to that greenfield thing, I don't see why you can't just say, yeah, you can build on that greenfield as long as you make the other area that you haven't built yet a greenfield area. Because having watched Clarkson's Farm, it is actually possible to rewild places. Quite a lengthy one, this one, so I'm skipping the NHS one. Uniting the Tories. After 12 years in office, the party has proved itself ungovernable for much of the past year. Sunak faced the challenge in getting a potentially unpopular mix of cuts and tax rises through Parliament. He is in a significantly stronger position than any of his rivals would have been in. More than half the parliamentary party publicly supported him. No. No, that's why he lost to Liz Truss. Because less than half the party publicly supported him. But that still leaves a significant minority who do not want him at the helm. Again, it's a majority if Liz Truss got in before him. There are also now 3 ex-Prime Ministers on the backbenches, including Boris Johnson, who has made it clear that he has not given up his ambitions to return to number 10. Electoral wipeout awaits in 2 years, recent polls suggest, and Sunak will argue that without unity there is no hope of salvation. Well, he's correct there. So what's the best thing to do? Put in the most unpopular MP to the party membership. The incoming Prime Minister spoke to the 1922 Committee of Backbenchers immediately after he was declared leader, telling MPs that they must unite or die. He can claim vindication for his economic approach after Truss was forced out by the markets following her mini-budget. Whether it unites a party of compulsive regicides remains to be seen. And we'll go into it later, but he is clearly trying to appease all factions of the party with his picks for the cabinet. The problem with that is if he ends up sidelining some people, as Suella Braverman was sidelined by Liz Truss on her immigration position, then it's absolutely pointless trying to appease those factions because you're clearly not going to address any of their issues. So this is the final one I care about, immigration. First, he must decide whether to push on with Truss's plan to relax controls to stimulate growth. My God, please don't do that. That was the only thing of Truss I actually hated. While this would boost forecasts for growth, it would break a manifesto commitment to reduce overall immigration and risk triggering a backlash from the right. It was this contradiction that triggered a row last week between Truss and Braverman, as I mentioned before. costing the latter her job at the Home Office, which in hindsight, I think Braverman basically resigned. I mean, she said, it's because I technically broke some ministerial code about state secrets or something like that. But as mentioned in my last video, Dominic Cummings clearly pointed out, this is something that every MP in the cabinet does, so it was a nothing. So really, it was probably just Braverman trying to get in writing to the public that everyone needs to resign from this cabinet because it is such a mess. And she probably wouldn't have done that if immigration was actually going to be tackled by Truss. Second, small boats. More than 38,000 people have crossed the English Channel this way so far this year. Going into election, having promised and conspicuously failed to slow this would be hugely damaging. It's been hugely damaging for years. The problem is, we know that Labour would just give them citizenship. On legal immigration, Sunak signalled that he would relax controls to boost some sectors, such as science, through allies insist he is socially conservative and won't open the door. On illegal migration, Sunak has pledged to maintain the Rwanda deportation policy, yes, and create a small boats task force to try and stop crossings. Also good if it is of any effect, which it hasn't been so far. He also wanted to end the use of hotels to house migrants and tighten the definition of who qualifies for asylum. Both decent things. And honestly, when it comes to high-skilled visas, more of them will be okay as long as low-skilled visas are effectively stopped, which was what the points-based system was supposed to be for, but there's been no real sign that that's worked. But don't expect any miracles from Sunak. He's there for 2 years. I mean, let's just face it. It might not be a Labour landslide victory, but I still think it's going to be a Labour win next election. And I just don't see what they're going to do in 2 years to actually bring immigration down to net 10,000. And every attempt to get the Rwanda policy off or to stop boats from crossing seems to just end in abject failure. So those were predictions from the Times about Sunak's time in government. But as usual, actions speak louder than words, so we're going to go through some cabinet roles to see how serious he is about some of the issues that I find most important. So first off, obviously Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's a big one. Jeremy Hunt, who endorsed Sunak for leadership, was widely expected to stay on as Chancellor, and he has. Had Sunak taken over in the summer, he would have been extremely unlikely to land the role, but he is now seen as a crucial part of calming the markets. Hunt said that he was honoured to serve our country after his reappointment, but warned that it is going to be tough. He said protecting the vulnerable and people's jobs, mortgages and bills will be at the front of our minds, so we work to restore stability, confidence and long-term growth. In the in-tray, Hunt and Sunak have only a few days to assemble what will effectively be a new budget due to be unveiled on Monday. It will have to fill a £40 billion hole in the government finances with a mixture of tax cuts and spending cuts. With a mixture of tax cuts, I don't think they mean tax cuts, I think they mean tax hikes. So this was pretty much expected, and as you can see, you can expect some spending cuts, and naturally Sunak's plans to go back and raise taxes, including corporation tax, as we go into a recession, which I hopefully don't have to tell you is one of the worst ideas known to man, and yet the madman's doing it. So next up is the olive branch to the anti-immigration side of the Tories. Braverman returns to the role 6 days after she was sacked for breaking the ministerial code in a security breach. Her decision to endorse Sunak on Sunday afternoon was pivotal in the leadership election, making it clear that Johnson would not win the universal support of the Tory right. Braverman's return suggests that Sunak will keep the Conservative manifesto pledge to reduce overall immigration, which was on the verge of being ripped up by Truss. Sources close to Braverman said Sunak had made the guarantee in return for her endorsement. So Braverman's actually played a pretty good hand there, in that she is there as the olive branch to the right of the Tory, hopefully to unite them, while at the same time doing what the right of the Tory party want, which is to reduce immigration. So maybe we'll see some results here. Again, we've been burned so many times for these promises, we have to wait and see. Tackling the Channel migrant crisis will be Braverman's top priority for a second spell as Home Secretary, with small boats crossing nearly 40,000 for the year. With the policy of deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda stuck in the courts over legal challenges, Braverman will focus on other measures, including a new deterrence deal with France, legislation to make deportations easier, and ending the practice of housing migrants in hotels, which is costing the taxpayer £5 million a day. I didn't know it was that high. Yes, I am absolutely for not housing these people in hotels. It's just very sad. I mean, I am not for giving out free handouts, but if you're going to give free handouts to anyone, why would you give them to random people crossing the Channel from France? Why do people who have put absolutely nothing into this country, and in fact, from the very first second of taking money out of the country because we need RNLI, the Royal Navy, and the Coast Guard to keep an eye on them, and then all of a sudden they get free money as well with it? And free accommodation. It's mad to me, but I've made so many videos on the Channel crossing crisis that there's no point going into it properly here. I hope that Brovman does something rapidly to stop it, because it is madness. Next up is Foreign Secretary James Cleverly. This comes as more of a surprise. A Johnson loyalist who backed the former Prime Minister's leadership challenge last week, Cleverly has been tipped for demotion. His retention is an olive branch to Johnson backers. Cleverly vowed, seriously times, get an editor. Cleverly vowed to continue defending democracy and freedom, especially standing with Ukraine. Top priority is the Western diplomatic effort to contain the fallout from the war in Ukraine. He must follow through on Truss's attempt to rebuild relations with France before planning a summit next year. Equally pressed will be the reach of a deal with the EU on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was set in motion by Truss. This is likely to be high priority for Sunak, who is known to want to avoid damaging a trade war with the EU. So that's all Foreign Secretary stuff. Pretty much what I'd expect from that, but it'll be interesting to keep an eye on, but nothing huge in my opinion. Next up is just a funny one, because it's funny. This is Dominic Raab coming back as Justice Secretary. Adding to the sense of continuity, Sunak brings Dominic Raab back into the cabinet with the same roles he had for the last year of the Johnson government. Raab stayed loyal to Sunak over the summer, even after it had become clear that Truss was overwhelmingly likely to defeat him, but he was also a key supporter of Johnson, refusing to take part in the mass resignation from the cabinet that ended in his premiership in July. Raab's return raises the prospect that his Bill of Rights will also be resurrected after being shelved under Liz Truss. Not great. He will have one less thing to worry about on his return because Brandon Lewis, whom he replaces, agreed a deal to end the barrister strike that had exacerbated the huge backlogs in the courts. Raab will also pick up the parole board reforms he had been working on to give ministers a veto on prison releases. The threat of big spending cuts poses a threat to a £4 billion prison building programme to create 20,000 spaces, half of which were promised in the Conservative manifesto. These spaces are vital because the prison population in England and Wales is projected to be a record 100,000 by 2026. At present it is 81,866, only 1,800 below capacity. Wow, we have a really bad crime problem. Pretty disappointed that there's nothing in there about the Communications Act, nothing in there about repealing a hell of a lot of laws that we don't need, like the Equalities Act, or basically any law brought in by Tony Blair. Instead, we only seem to be getting additional laws, even more laws we don't freaking need. But also, the reason I say this is funny is because when Raab was announced to be Justice Secretary, I know civil servants in the Justice Department, and they apparently just got him off the payroll, only to then the next day be told they have to put him back on it. And I think the last person I'll go through is Kemi Badenoch, who would have been my favourite for PM, but I don't mind her getting the experience in for now before she does become PM. Badenoch, 42, I don't know why they tell us her age, but whatever, was said to be delighted to keep her job as International Trade Secretary, and she has been also picked up as the Equalities Brief. She was the surprise star of the summer leadership contest, and having been consistently rated by pollsters as a grassroots favourite, she is tipped to make another run for number 10 in the future, and by God I hope she gets it. Top of the agenda is the stalled India trade deal, which was due to be signed this month but has now been kicked into the long grass. Despite Sunak's Indian roots, Delhi is unlikely to drop its demands to make it easier for its citizens to come and work and study in the UK in return for opening up Indian markets to British service companies. Yes, we're effectively going to have free movement with India. A country with 1 billion people. Don't think that would be a good idea. That would be very much one-way movement. This will be unpalatable to the government and may force Badenoch to settle for a limited deal covering some goods. Let's hope so, and let's hope as Women and Equalities Minister she just absolutely rips that department from inside out. I can guarantee if she does that, she is going to be Prime Minister in the next decade. But my last video was also saying, man, I really hope Boris Johnson becomes PM, and in hindsight, it wasn't going to happen. But I do love riding those white-pilled waves And honestly, when it really comes down to it, there's still nothing positive I can see from having an alternative government to the Tories in power. Yes, they are managed decline, but I think I'll take managed slow decline over a complete and utter falling off a cliff, given you're more likely to survive a slow and managed fall rather than falling off a cliff. And it appears that quite a lot of people agree with that. Half of voters trust Rishi Sunak with the economy poll finds. New PM enters number 10 with higher expectations than trust, but most want a general election, which obviously they would. At a change of two leaders, it's quite hard to avoid a general election, but Rishi Sunak avoided it. We're not going to have a snap election. Rishi Sunak is trusted to manage the economy well, a poll has found, with 7 in 10 voters thinking that he will make a better leader than Truss. Former Chancellor enters Downing Street with significantly higher expectations than his predecessor at number 10, but a majority of voters appear to favour an early general election. The YouGov poll found that 50% of voters trust him to manage the economy well, compared with 36% who did not, and under that you can see a YouGov poll finding Keir Starmer the most favourable person to be PM, and as you go down it's various Tory MPs such as Rishi Sunak, then Penny Mordaunt, then Boris Johnson, and finally at the bottom 20% find the Conservative Party favourable, compared with 78% who do not. In other words, out of 1,000 people polled, most people seem to want Keir Starmer. However, polls, much like scientific or economic models, are all incorrect, but they're the best thing we've got. And I mean, this article just shows how fickle the people are. You can't trust people. People like Coldplay voted for Hitler. So in the past fortnight, Sunak's net favourability rating has risen from minus 21 points to minus 9. He still trails behind Starmer, who has a net favourability rating of 3. There are further signs that voters have warmed to Sunak since the collapse of the Truss government. In August, during the summer Tory leadership contest, 22% of voters thought he had done a good job as Chancellor. That figure has now jumped to 53%. Nevertheless, voters do not trust Sunak on most policy areas, including the NHS, climate change, housing, immigration, defence, Brexit, education, and law and order. Voters trust him on Ukraine. The public not trusting him on X, Y, or Z is very hard to understand what that means from a poll. Does that mean they don't trust him to lower or raise immigration? Does that mean they don't trust him to dismantle the NHS well? Or do they not trust that he will keep running the NHS into the ground, i.e. keep it going as it is? On the environment, does that mean people don't trust him to get to net zero? Or does it mean people like me who think he's going to go absolutely nuts and try and go whole hog to get net zero by 2030? So it's not a great poll, but I do just want to point out that clearly this is not going to lead to a total collapse of the Tory party, despite quite a lot of members leaving and Reform claiming that hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, have joined Reform over the past week. So it entirely depends where Sunak goes from here. So far, it has not been the most disappointing government I've seen in my life, but there is plenty of potential for me to get very angry in these videos. For now, I'm just going to relax and see where it takes me. Naturally, I'm hoping for the best, but I'm expecting the worst. But anyway, that's everything I had for you today. So as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.